The San Francisco skyline was flashing 300 floors below me. But all I could see was the reflection of Aunt Karen's diamond earrings. I was trapped in the center of the venture capital gala, cornered by my family, surrounded by industry titans. Karen, dressed in enough silk to fund a small startup, smiled wide, but spoke with a snake's hiss. Skylar, darling, we are just so generous to our little engineer, aren't we? Such a shame. Your project went over budget by $3.27 million. Uncle Gary, our family's legal counsel, slid a contract across the polished steel table. My cousin Mason, the Nepo baby, who got the credit for my work, leaned close and whispered, "Time to pay up. Skylar, just sign over the algorithm. It's what you owe us." The entire room was watching the spectacle. The contract was my life's work. And my hand reached for the pen, shaking slightly. I had nowhere left to run. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I didn't sign it. Not yet. I was close. Closer than I'd ever been to giving up my soul's work just to make the public humiliation stop. But something deep inside a spark that hadn't been extinguished by years of neglect made my hand hesitate. I pulled it back, just an inch, and that inch was enough to let the memory flood in. I looked at Aunt Karen's expectant, greedy face and saw every year of my 20s flash behind her eyes. I was 21 when I wrote the core code, the algorithm that now powers 80% of the family's tech infrastructure. I did it out of love, or maybe out of the desperate, aching need for their approval. I was the quiet one, the one who lived in the code. While Mason was out shaking hands and taking credit, he was the golden boy, the charismatic face, and I was the ghostwriter who got paid in family investment opportunities. Uncle Gary, the lawyer, was the true architect of my misery. He knew I was brilliant, but naive. And he weaponized that naivete. He sold me on the idea that they were incubating my IP, protecting it, helping me grow. He formalized my relationship with the family holding company, the same one Karen now ran with a contract I barely understood. It read like a partnership, but it was nothing more than a high-tech leash. They kept me chronically underfunded. Every time my software was ready to break out, they would swoop in with a new emergency capital injection. That $3.27 million wasn't a real debt I owed for a business mistake. It was the accumulated cost of every emergency loan, every investment round, where they bought out my equity for pennies. Every time they covered a small utility bill, just to remind me who was holding the purse strings. Every transaction was designed to erode my confidence and increase my dependence. It wasn't about money. It was about control. Karen knew if she kept me just poor enough to need them, and just rich enough to have something they wanted, I would stay in their orbit. They didn't want my money. They wanted my constant presence. As their puppet genius, I started believing that I was incompetent in business. I was a software engineer, a visionary, yet I couldn't seem to launch a single successful product without their help that always came with crippling terms. This is what psychologists call learned helplessness. It's the module they unintentionally installed in my brain. After repeated exposure to uncontrollable negative events, like having my genius diminished and my finances sabotaged, I simply stopped trying to fight back. I accepted the narrative. I am brilliant, but I am incapable of independence. That narrative was comforting in its own sick way. It meant the pain wasn't my fault. But the price of admission to a family I desperately wanted to belong to? So, I showed up to their galas, took their condescending comments, and kept coding. I endured the public shaming, because the alternative, true, utter severance, felt like a terrifying black hole. It felt easier to suffer abuse within the system than to survive outside of it. But standing there in the penthouse, with the scent of expensive wine and my future hanging on the tip of a cheap fountain pen, the mechanism finally snapped. The humiliation was too sharp, too public. The pen hovered, waiting for the signature that would complete their ultimate theft, not of money, but of my identity. This was the moment of truth. Either I signed and confirmed their lie, or I found a new, terrifying strength. I looked up at Gary, who was practically vibrating with anticipation, and at Karen, who was ready to announce her victory to the room of venture capitalists. The sound of their self-satisfaction was almost deafening. And that's when I heard a noise that cut through the entire penthouse. It wasn't a sound of confrontation or a security alarm. It was the sound of a well-oiled wheelchair. That sound, the low, precise whir of a custom electric wheelchair, cut the penthouse silence like a laser. Karen's face, already contorted with triumph, froze mid-smirk. Everyone turned. And then Eleanor arrived. She was 75, the true matriarch, and the only person in that room whose wealth wasn't measured in the current market cap of the family, She was in a custom carbon fiber chair, propelled by her longtime legal counsel, Mr. Davies. Karen and Gary looked like children caught stealing candy from their mother's purse. Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Karen, Gary, please tell me you haven't forced Skylar to sign anything yet. That document is invalid. Karen stammered, recovering quickly. Mother, this is a private matter, a disciplinary action. Skylar's venture is bankrupt, and we're mitigating losses. She knows the rules. Eleanor ignored her, gesturing to Mr. Davies. He placed a thick, sealed folder on the table, pushing aside Gary's cheap contract. This, Eleanor stated, her voice ironclad, is a legal decree filed 1 hour ago, effective immediately. Under the founding documents of the family holding company, I am exercising my right as the primary original seed investor to initiate a hostile seizure of all intellectual property, physical assets, and executive control related to the subsidiary known as TechCore. That includes the algorithm. Skylar. I felt the blood rush from my head. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was pure, dizzying adrenaline. Karen exploded. Mother, you can't. This is my firm. This is my legacy. It was your father's firm, Karen. Eleanor corrected calmly, which you and Gary have been systematically dismantling since 1998. I am simply invoking the betrayal clause. This document strips both you and Gary of your executive titles and freezes every corporate account. The debt Skylar supposedly owes is now void. The IP is mine. Mason stepped forward, trying to look important. Grandma, with all respect, this timing is terrible. We were about to close a $20 million round that would save the year. Eleanor simply smiled, but it was cold enough to frost the glass tower. Oh, I know the timing. Mason, I picked it. This was the part I hadn't understood. Why now? Why wait until I was publicly broken? Until the pen was in my hand, I realized then that Eleanor wasn't just a savior, she was a teacher. Later, Mr. Davies explained her philosophy, which I now call the theory of the 3-second decision. Eleanor believed that you cannot truly save someone who hasn't first decided to save themselves. Intervention too early just creates dependence. She saw me, on the edge of the abyss, ready to sign my life away out of that crippling, learned helplessness. The moment I hesitated, the moment my fingers drew back just an inch, was my own personal 3-second moment, the fraction of time where I chose not to surrender. That was the signal she was waiting for. She needed me to find the courage to defy them, even just internally, so that her act of rescue became an act of liberation, not just a handout. She wanted to rescue the woman, not just the code. "I have watched you, Skylar," Eleanor said, looking past Karen and Gary directly into my eyes. "I watched them systematically break you down. I could have intervened years ago, but you would have just run back to them the moment I turned my back. You needed to feel the true weight of their betrayal, not just the financial weight, but the moral decay." Then came the final turn, the first of the deep twists that proved this wasn't just a business fight. Gary. Eleanor addressed the lawyer. "You know the penalty for fraud under the founding documents. The IP is transferred to me, and tomorrow, we file federal charges." Gary's face went white. Karen screamed, not in anger, but in pure fear. "Fraud? What fraud? We just bought out an asset." Eleanor looked at me again. The shame was gone. The spotlight was no longer on my humiliation, but on their sudden, terrifying collapse. The reversal was complete. The victim had become the witness. Eleanor's words hung in the air. "Gary, you know the penalty for fraud under the founding documents. The IP is transferred to me, and tomorrow, we file federal charges." Karen was still shouting about her legacy, but the color had completely drained from Gary's face. The architect of the $3.27 million scam, he was terrified of something bigger than losing his CEO title. That's when I realized the fraud wasn't just about cheating me. It was about cheating Eleanor. "Two." Eleanor nodded to her lawyer. "Mr. Davies." And he stepped into the light. He held up a thick document. Not the one Gary had brought, but an older one. "The debt is void." "Yes." Mr. Davies confirmed. "But the criminal element is this. Karen and Gary intended to use the seized IP to launch a new shell corporation with their son, Mason, listed as the lead innovator. They were going to file the code as entirely new, transferring Skylar's work to Mason and effectively stealing it twice. Mason actually looked proud for a split second, until Mr. Davies continued, "The reason this is federal IP fraud, and not just a civil theft, is because Skylar's core algorithm, the one Karen and Gary are so desperate for, was built using foundational coding that Eleanor herself wrote in the late 1980s, specifically for a private family research project. That was the deep twist. My algorithm, the one they called worthless until they tried to steal it, wasn't just my betrayed ingenuity. It was a continuation of Eleanor's. It was her original vision, which she had kept legally protected but dormant for decades, waiting for the right moment or the right person to pick up the torch. And that person was me." Karen screamed, truly unhinged this time. That code was obsolete. It was a decade of dust. Legally protected dust. Eleanor corrected, her voice cold, and a violation of the founding documents to ever use commercially without my express written consent, which, of course, you never bothered to ask for. Karen. Gary, the seasoned lawyer, finally collapsed. He tried to argue about technicalities, shouting about source code repositories and license agreements, but it was over. My code was legally protected, not only by my work, but by Eleanor's original, ironclad intellectual property rights. The IP they were trying to steal had belonged to Eleanor first, making their action corporate espionage on a generational level. I stood beside Eleanor's wheelchair, watching Karen's entire world shatter. It wasn't just the loss of the company or the exposure of their financial schemes. They had tried to replace my brilliance with their son's undeserved credit. And in doing so, they had committed a massive felony that tied back to the very origins of their family's wealth. I felt a surge of energy so intense, it almost felt physical. It wasn't triumph. It was the chilling, clinical satisfaction of seeing a virus eradicated. They weren't just ungrateful family members anymore. They were confirmed criminals whose greed had been exposed on a stage far bigger than they could ever handle. This was no longer a squabble over $3.27 million. This was a battle for the soul of the technology industry. And we had just won the first brutal round. The next fight would be even more public. The morning after the gala felt like a slow-motion car crash. Karen and Gary had tried to contain the damage, the public spectacle of Eleanor's intervention, and Mr. Davies' pronouncement had already leaked through the tech world grapevine. But they were failing. The media, scenting a corporate scandal mixed with family betrayal, was in a frenzy. The family holding company, TechCore, was facing more than just a legal challenge. It was facing an implosion of trust. Gary scrambled to assemble a crisis management team. A ludicrous effort, considering the crisis was fundamentally their own criminal greed. They called a hastily arranged press conference. Their final, desperate attempt to spin the narrative. Skylar is an unstable relative trying to hijack a stable family business. I didn't attend. I was with Eleanor, watching it all unfold on a massive screen in her private study. Mr. Davies had uploaded all the relevant legal filings, the real ones, the ones detailing the IP fraud and the founding documents violation, to a secure journalistic database. An hour before the press conference began, Karen walked onto the stage, flanked by a few nervous executives. Her suit immaculate, her smile brittle. She started reading a prepared statement, hitting all the predictable notes. This is a baseless attack, motivated by personal resentment. We are confident the court will see this for what it is, a sad family dispute. But the media knew. The questions came fast and hard. Quoting directly from the documents Mr. Davies had provided, is it true that the proprietary algorithm Karen tried to seize was actually based on Eleanor's legally protected source code from the 1980s? Is Mason currently under investigation for corporate espionage regarding the Prado? Unauthorized filing? You could see the moment Karen realized her narrative was dead. Her eyes darted to Gary, who stood stone-faced, legally forbidden from speaking. Her professional veneer shattered. She stopped reading the teleprompter. "This is my company," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she slammed her hand down on the podium. The microphone feedback screeched, amplifying her raw, terrified outrage. "I built this. Skylar is nothing. She is a ghost, a parasitic coder who thinks she deserves the world because she knows how to type. She has no idea what it takes to run a multi-million-dollar operation. It was the ultimate public self-destruction, man terhui konghai. This wasn't professional spin. This was the truth of her malice. Broadcast live to the world. It was a spectacular, unscripted display of arrogance and collapse, giving the public exactly the villain they needed to complete their catharsis. The video of Karen screaming went viral within minutes. Mason's attempts to smear me on social media were immediately met with thousands of comments linking back to Mr. Perfation. Davies' file, the facts were already out, and they were lethal. The family's professional standing evaporated faster than dry ice. I watched Karen's televised breakdown and felt something cold and hard melt away inside me. It wasn't pity. It was the release of years of indignation. I didn't have to seek revenge. I only had to step out of their way and let their own corruption execute the justice. This was karmic justice, delivered via fiber optic cable. The power flip was complete. The people who had controlled my life were now spiraling, unable to control their own 30-second sound bites. The legal process was swift after that. With the overwhelming evidence of fraud and the public relations catastrophe of Karen's meltdown, the family holding company was restructured and liquidated. The $3.27 million fraudulent debt was dissolved, and the IP, my algorithm and Eleanor's foundational code was legally secured under my full, independent ownership. The toxic branch of the family faced civil suits and federal investigations. They were permanently dissolved from any position of influence. Eleanor passed away peacefully 3 months later, leaving me a private note. It read, "The courage wasn't in the code, Skylar. It was in the pause before you signed. Now, show them what you build when you build it for purpose, not for pain." I realized then that true victory was not about watching them lose. It was about finally being free to choose my own definition of family and success. My revenge was over, but my work was just beginning. I took the acquired venture capital and the value of my now liberated IP, and I founded the Eleanor Initiative. It was a non-profit foundation dedicated to funding and mentoring young, marginalized female engineers who were being undervalued or pushed out of the industry by people like Karen and Gary. I wasn't just building an empire anymore. I was building a community. I chose to enact buông bỏ huyết thống, tìm lại chính mình, letting go of blood ties, finding self. I realized that I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn a place at a table that was never meant for me. The concept of blood had been a chain, not a bond. The pain of cutting off a toxic family is often followed by profound guilt. You feel like you're giving up a piece of yourself. But I learned that the only thing I was giving up was the ache of not belonging. My value wasn't inherited. It was coded. My family wasn't defined by shared DNA. It was defined by shared vision and mutual respect. The greatest revenge isn't ruin. It's altruism. It's using the power you gained from enduring pain to ensure that the next generation never has to go through it. I used the money they tried to steal to fund the betrayed ingenuity of dozens of young women, turning a generational crime into a generational opportunity. I sit in my own office now, surrounded by people who see my worth instantly, not reluctantly. My empire is stable because it's built on talent and purpose, not fraud and shame. The whole ordeal taught me one final truth. You don't need a powerful family to have a powerful life. You just need the courage to code your own destiny.